So I knew nothing about Wes Huff until I watched the Joe Rogan's podcast. And apparently neither did Joe.
To you because of the debate
that
you had with Billy Carson.
Quote unquote.
You know, it's one of those things where it's very unfortunate when people get caught with their pants down. And I'm not an expert in many things, but the things that I am an expert on, you could wake me up at 4 o'clock in the morning and ask me about those things. And I go, oh yeah, seems like he does not have that. And he is a wonderful talker and it's a lot of fun. I like watching his videos. I love all that ancient history stuff and even the most ridiculous tinfoil hat aspects of ancient. It's fun.
It's entertainment.
But I know that there's a different, like Andrew Schultz and I had a discussion about this. Like he said when he had Billy on the podcast, he said, we're not going to research anything. We're not going to search anything. We're not going to do anything. We'll just let him talk because it's fun.
Yeah.
But when he was on with you, it was quite apparent that you are an actual expert in the Bible and in many religious texts, and that he didn't necessarily have the facts.
Right there, I had to stop watching the episode and do some research. I was like, okay, so who exactly is this guy, Wes Huff, and who exactly is Billy Carson, and what kind of debate did they have? So I had to find out the story for myself. And so I went down this Billy Carson, Wes Huff saga. I went down this rabbit hole because I wanted to hear the debate. But not only that, I was like, okay, let me Google this guy, Wes Huff, and see, what he's about. So I came across this really nice introduction.
With all the work that you've done in seminary, with your doctoral work in the area of theology and manuscripts, what got you interested in the Bible?
I realized that I was engaging with a lot of people, with Muslims, with Mormons, with Jehovah's Witnesses, skeptics of all different stripes. All of them would resort to some sort of, well, that sounds great, Wes, but all you're relying on is the Bible. That's your foundation. And you can't trust that. All you have are translations of translations of translations. All you have are error-ridden copies. You don't even know if you have the right books. You're reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but have you ever heard of the Gospel of Thomas? And so I realized that that was a genuine critique if it was true. If that was true, I'm staking my entire life on the person of Jesus. And where do I find the information about Jesus? I find that in the Bible. And if I can't trust the Bible, I really have no reason to put my hope and trust in Jesus.
And then right away, I'm like, okay, I really like this guy, Wes Huff. He seems like he knows his stuff just from this little intro. Then I was like, let me look into Billy Carson because I wasn't familiar with his work. So I go on YouTube and I watch a bunch of his videos and I pretty much get the gist that he is this, new agey kind of guru. He claims in many of his videos that he's an expert on ancient civilizations and he's into also extraterrestrial beings and aliens. And so he has these very new agey kind of belief systems of spirituality, and he's written many books and sold many books. So clearly he has a presence and a following, even more than Wes Huff did. So I was like, I have to watch this debate for myself. I really want to see, what went wrong, what went down, who won this debate, what were the points that were made. So let's watch this specific part of the debate that kind of really exposes and shows what happened, what went wrong that, Wes Huff ended up on Joe Rogan's podcast.
If you want to, I guess, go first, Billy, as to how you came about the findings where it seems that Jesus was not crucified or that's not accurate.
Sure. And in my videos, and if you listen to the podcast, the statement is according to the Sinai Bible, Jesus wasn't crucified in that Bible. That Bible predates the King James Version of the Bible. And the text there actually is about 12 to 14,000 differences between the Sinai Bible and the King James Version of the Bible, which came much later. And then also one of the things that were interesting is that they discovered the book of Jesus' wife, which is at the Harvard Seminary. According to some scholars, it's a little controversial, but they claim that this is an accurate record that Jesus may have even been married, which then, adds more, if that's true, it adds more to the hypothesis that maybe he wasn't crucified. I just personally believe that Jesus was an amazing human being. I don't think that he was the Son of God in the sense that he's God, but that we're all gods. As he said, ye are gods, and that we're to do greater things in him. And I just personally believe that the return of the Christ is the return of the Christ consciousness. When we can all achieve a certain level of knowledge, wisdom, passion, understanding, empathy, love that he came to this planet with, and we get that in our mind and our conscience, and we can act on that, those incredible emotions and that understanding, that the whole world is going to transform instantaneously. And I think at the second coming is the coming of the Christ consciousness to the planet, not a human being flying back to Earth to save people. That's just my personal understanding of how I've perceived it over many, many years of going through this information and going through all this text.
And notice that he says here in this debate, conversation, whatever you want to call it, many years of investigation, many years of, basically he says that he claims the expertise. In many of his other videos, he talks about how he is an expert in ancient civilizations, how he's an expert in X and Y and Z. So, it's quite interesting. You're an expert until you really meet a real expert.
And Wes, I'm gonna let you respond to that. And again, I mean, this is everyone listening to the show. I'm always like, challenge everything, learn to critically think, and continue to come to your conclusions. Even with Jesus, I'm not personally even waiting on that he has to come back to. I already know like I said, that strength of God and consciousness is already. I can tap into that right now.
Yeah, well, first let me say, I think it's really cool to not just be in the room proverbially with you, Billy, but be able to interact with you, because I wish I could be there in person. Unfortunately, Toronto, Canada is a long way away from Florida. It's a little bit of a jaunt, but I really appreciate the fact that you seem to have investigated to a certain degree some of these facts. Do you mind if I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
When you say the Sinai Bible, what are you referring to specifically?
It's the biblical text that was written. It made it into you can actually look it up on Amazon. It's a Bible called, I have a version at home. It's called the Sinai Bible, right, from Mount Sinai. I'm assuming that's the mountain that they're referencing there. But they put together their own version of the biblical text prior to the King James Version being put out.
When you refer to the Sinai Bible, would you be referring to Codex Sinaiticus, like the codex that comes? Okay, that's why I was trying to get some clarification, because so you can actually go and see Codex Sinaiticus is at the British Library, so you can go and see it. It's on display, and the British Library has actually digitized the entire manuscript. So I work with manuscripts in my linguistic work. I'm an expert on early Christian scribal culture, and particularly in Greek and Coptic manuscripts. I have a facsimile. So I have a photocopy that was done by the British Library of Codex Sinaiticus that I work with in my office. So I have it here. And the only reason I asked for clarification is because I want to make sure that what I'm addressing is actually what you mean.
Gotcha.
And not addressing something else. Because the Codex Sinaiticus in particular is just it's a 4th century Greek manuscript. It comes from approximately between 325 and 350 AD. And its text of the Gospels reads almost identical to the modern Greek text that we develop translations from. So my curiosity is just simply in kind of exploring, when you say that it denies the crucifixion, or that the crucifixion isn't there, I mean, I can go on right now, Codex Sinaiticus, and I can look up the end of Matthew 27, where it has Jesus being crucified, and that's in Codex Sinaiticus, or the John 19, or any of the other ones. So I think my confusion is that it doesn't read any differently. So actually, are you able to pull up a website with the viewers or listeners or whatever be able to see that
right now to make sure I have the version that I'm looking at?
While he's pulling that up too, where was that piece
I found
discovered?
the text where I was referencing. Actually, I was misquoted. I misquoted there. It's the Gospel of Barnabas.
Okay, yeah. Well, so that's good. So let's deal with that too, because I've actually worked with. There are 2 manuscripts of the Gospel of Barnabas. The Gospel of Barnabas is a really interesting document because it is a known forgery, and so that's why I think it's important to get to these sources. So at the very start of the Gospel of Barnabas, which we only have 2 copies of, one is in Italian and one is in Spanish, we see right off the bat that the Gospel of Barnabas, not to be confused with either the Epistle of Barnabas or the Acts of Barnabas, which are 2 apocryphal documents from the 2nd century, but the Gospel of Barnabas in particular, we know it's a forgery because it does things like in chapter 92, it says that Jesus spent 40 days on Mount Sinai, and then he came to the Jordan River and he walked to Jerusalem. But Mount Sinai is more than a week's journey away from Jerusalem, and neither Mount Sinai nor Jerusalem are close to the Jordan River. So never mind there not being a route from the Jordan River to around Mount Sinai or going to Jerusalem, but there are internal problems with the Gospel of Barnabas which indicate that it shows no actual indication of evidence of coming from or even having knowledge of 1st century Jewish understanding. It actually says Jesus is the Christ but not the Messiah, which indicates that whoever the author is, he didn't know that those were the same words. words. And I think a bigger problem is that the Gospel of Barnabas actually paraphrases Dante's Inferno, which was written in 1314. So there's a lot of internal evidences that disqualify the Gospel of Barnabas, never mind the fact that we don't have any evidence of it prior to the 14th century.
The whole debate is much longer, and I watched the whole entire thing. Throughout the whole time, Wes Huff is so patient, he's so respectful, he's so on point, but he clearly dismantles, Billy Carson and basically breaks down and shows what a fraud he is and how he spreads misinformation. He doesn't know his work. He's not an expert. And it was so satisfying to see, but it was done in the most respectful manner possible, which was a really great lesson to me as a Christian, is that is how we are not in it to win arguments. We're in there to really show people the truth. It's not only important what we say and the evidence that we provide, but it's also important how we say it. And the people who are actually interested in the truth, unlike Billy Carson, and we'll go into the reasons why he was not interested in the truth. But people who actually are interested in truth and are actual truth seeker, we can change their minds. We can open up a whole new perspective to them. But this was not the case with Billy Carson, who was completely offended. He was very offended by this whole thing, to the point that he decided to sue Mark Minard, with whom he was friends, the guy who was moderating the debate, and sue also Wes Huff, which is so ridiculous. He actually released, a video talking about different excuses as to why he felt like the whole, setup, it was an ambush, he was not prepared. He talks about how he was sick, how he thought it was just going to be a conversation. He didn't even know who this guy is, and he talks with such a pompous and such an exclusive way that it tells that he's just a fraud. And a lot of these people who are in this new age space, all of these, spiritual knowledge, so many of them are fraud. And what they're after is money and just basically exploiting people and people's vulnerabilities. So here's the clip of Billy Carson talking about what actually went wrong with this debate.
I really thought it was just going to be like a casual conversation about our perspectives on reality and our perspectives on religion versus spirituality. I really didn't know it was going to be any kind of a debate. Okay, it's more of an ambush situation, and I have all the text messages to prove this, which are going to be in the discovery for defendant number one. Anyway, so I go over there. I'm a little gassed, but whatever. I'm just happy to be involved in anything at this point. I sit down, get mic'd up and everything else. I get myself some water. I give him that warning about my coughing so that he knows, if you just pause it every now and then, you might have to edit the coughs out. He brings on this guy on the screen, defendant number two. So defendant number two comes on the screen. I have no idea who this guy is. I literally have no clue who this guy is. I don't recognize him from anywhere. Some Joe Schmo off the street. I have no clue who this guy is. But whatever. He seemed like a nice gentleman. I thought we were going to have a really nice conversation. Now, this whole time, I'm thinking this is just going to be a conversational based thing. Not a big deal. I don't got to stress my brain. I don't got to think too hard. We're just talking. And I'm like, okay, whatever. So I give my answer about the gospel of Jesus' wife, to what I knew about it. Not even a deep answer, just a very surface answer. I'm just like, whatever, man. I'm just surviving at this moment. And then the gentleman, defendant number two, he comes back with all this rhetoric about it's a known fake and it's this and that and everything else and it's no good and it doesn't exist and blah, 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 or it's fake or whatever he's talking about. Okay, I'm a person just like you guys are. And to that effect, and being in that weakened state, which he knew he caught me at one of my most weakest states. He saw how I only weighed 206 pounds at his house. So I was very, very frail and thin. I've gained back now 15 pounds, but at the time I was very thin, just weak. But I'm human. I might have bumbled the Barnabas text for the Sinai text or whatever. It doesn't really matter. What matters is I never got a chance to answer any questions or get my voice heard.
So he completely misframes this whole conversation as you guys watch the debate. But anyway, this debate between Billy Carson and Wes Huff got so viral that even Joe Rogan watched it and came across it. And so he invited then Wes Huff onto his podcast and they had some amazing conversations. I actually watched the whole 3-hour episode. It's wonderful. It's full of, they talked about ancient civilizations. They talked about ancient languages. But I would say the part of the whole podcast that was very interesting was the last hour. And this is what I want to, watch with you guys and kind of comment a little bit on when he talks about, atheism, things that are wrong with atheism. He talks about miracles, and then they go into the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. And lastly, to talk about the authority of scripture, why do we trust the 4 gospels? And so that's kind of what I want to divide the rest of this video, is to go into those 3 parts, because I think it's a wealth of knowledge. If you're a Christian, it will definitely edify your knowledge. And I think any Christian should have a baseline of apologetic knowledge, because that's how we should be prepared to give a defense for the faith that we have. The field of apologetics is very important, and maybe we don't all are called to know this field the way Wes Huff does, but I think we should know in part some of these things so we can talk to people, so we can challenge people's perspective, not win arguments or anything like that, but we can really minister to people and frame the gospel in a very intelligent way, because, our faith is not based, in just some fairy tales. Our faith is rooted in real history. And that is something that we need to be aware of as Christians. Yes, there's things that we don't know, and there's, following Jesus is a step of faith. So let's jump into the first part where they talk about atheism and miracles.
However many billions of years ago, there was nothing.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden there was something. And Terence McKenna had a great line that said that science requires one miracle, the Big Bang. It requires a miracle.
Well, I always say that when people ask me about, the miracles in the Bible. Yeah. And I say, well, if the first miracle happened, if everything, nothing became everything, then, Jesus turning water into wine.
That's an easy one.
Well, yeah.
That's a party trick.
Yeah, exactly.
It really is nothing compared to the birth of the universe, but we're convinced at the creation of the universe, and we're very skeptical at other miracles. It's very odd.
This is such a great point. Because, people will always say, like, how can you believe in miracles in the Bible, But then they forget that scientists literally believe in a Big Bang, which is a miracle of in itself. So you believe in the miracle of the universe, this grand miracle, right? But you have a hard time believing in the miracles that are mentioned in the Bible. So even scientists, who want to deny God, to practice their science, they have to believe in a miracle. Most of them agree with the Big Bang, but how did something come out of nothing? So there is a step of faith that atheists take. Just as much there's a step of faith that Christians take, but at least Christians are honest about it.
Have you ever had a debate with a snarky atheist?
Yeah.
I think that would be fun. I think it would be a fascinating conversation, because I'm sure, atheists, they vary just like Christians vary, but the worst versions of them are essentially believers in the religion of atheism. They worship the concept of there being no God, and this is it, when you die, nothing happens.
Yeah.
And that to me is always so arrogant.
I literally, when he says that, I automatically think of Richard Dawkins. I feel like he embodies this sort of superiority when there's so many holes in the theory.
Just the fact that you exist at all is so bizarre and so spectacular. The idea that for sure that when the lights shut out, that's a wrap because there's no evidence of the contrary. Well, okay. Absence of evidence is not evidence. It's especially when you're talking about something that's as bizarre as death. Mm-hmm. I just think it's a little silly, because how could you know what you don't know? Yeah. You cannot know what you don't know. And the problem is that there's a cachet, that there's a social credit amongst academics in particular that's ascribed to a person who is atheist, a person who he's brilliant, he's not silly, he doesn't believe in myths, I get it. I get why there's social pressure in that regard. I get it. But to not look at the universe itself, just this creation engine of planets and stellar nurseries, just the bizarreness of the epicness of it all, and to not wonder if maybe you have a very narrow perception of what this whole thing is all about.
Yeah. Deny the virgin birth, but not the virgin birth of the universe.
Yeah. We want to think that things are very clean and easy to measure. And they often are not. Most of what it means to be a human being in a meaningful way is not measurable. Most of it. Love and friendship and community, these things are not very measurable. They're very strange. Whatever good is, it's a very real thing, and it seems to not exist, certainly not in the volume in other animals that exists in us. Why is our version of life so much more rich and complicated than any other being that exists? And why do we have this insatiable desire to learn and know more?
Why does this, however many 3 pounds of gray matter in my brain, why is that able to plummet the intricacies of the universe? Right. And I think that's ultimately the questions that we should be asking, in terms of, you matter more than you are matter. There's something going on there.
There's something going on with all of us.
Yeah.
We kind of know it and we don't know it, but it's just, you can't measure it and you can't put it on a scale, and so people don't like that. It makes them feel dumb to even speculate, to even just say, what do you think happens when you die? Even that conversation is people don't like that. Nothing. It goes dark and that's it. It's over. That's it. You die. How the fuck do you know? Have you died?
Because the basis of atheism is materialism, is the world of matter, which denies the metaphysical That's where it actually falls apart, because there's so many things in our universe that are like love and hate and all these things that are metaphysical, that are not within the realm of the measured science, that are still part of our human reality and our experience. And here's the thing, just the brain itself, yes, it's a real organic thing, but what is consciousness? That is not something that we can use, measure, and quantify by the terms of atheism, you know? There's something above. There's the physical, but there's the metaphysical, the things that we cannot explain, but that doesn't make them less real just because they're not physical. And this is what, basically, essentially Joe Rogan gets at here. So after they talk about this, they transition into talking about the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. And I absolutely love all the points that Wes Huff makes.
What is your personal belief when it comes to the resurrection? Do you have a belief, or do you just try to interpret the text and try to see what is the message?
As a historian, I do think it is a historical question. You have a guy who objectively lived, he objectively died, and then individuals close to his inner circle claim that they see him not dead.
Right.
Again.
This is a highly unusual activity.
Highly unusual.
Right. So, but it's hard when you're dealing with illiterate populations, you're dealing with thousands of years of time, you're dealing with an oral tradition, and then you have us sitting here talking about it. Mm-hmm. In 2024, trying to figure it at the end of 2024, trying to figure this out. It's very difficult for anybody who thinks of themselves as an intelligent person who's secular to even entertain the possibility that someone died and come back to life.
And I get that. But we've already talked about the fact that we don't think that the only thing that exists is matter and motion. We as in you and I, right? Like, we believe that there's something else going on in this world that's a little bit crazy.
There's something else.
And that to, I think, exclude that, excludes something that you're kind of putting blinders on for. And you do have, you're right in terms of all of these ancient conventions and the ways that things were spread around. But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses.
This is a profound thing, because most of history was passed on through oral tradition. And even somebody like Alexander the Great, right? Alexander the Great lived, but the first accounts of his life weren't written until almost 350 years after his life. But what's fascinating about Jesus is that literally the events, the resurrection and the crucifixion, were written during the 1st and 2nd century, like 40 to 50 years after the event. Like that, historically, that's a very close window, and that's significant.
And they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things. So
how do you fact-check someone coming back from the dead?
Well, how
many people saw his body, right?
Well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people saw the crucifixion?
No, saw the resurrected Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once. If we read the Gospel of Luke and Acts, so same author wrote both documents, he says that Jesus was walking around teaching them for 40 days after he was resurrected from the dead. And so these are written within a time period when you have people who would have seen Jesus's ministry, who were there, say at something like the feeding of the 5,000, who could have been able to verify or debunk some of these things that are being said. And you go from a bunch of scared guys because Jesus wasn't the only messianic figure who arose and claimed to be the Messiah.
Right.
There were a number of individuals both prior to and after Jesus, but they die and the movement dies with them.
Do you think it's possible that he didn't die? And do you think it's possible that they thought he was dead? Because that does happen. There was actually a case very recently where a guy was about to be harvested for organs. They thought he was dead, and this guy started moving again and came back to life. It's a very, very bizarre case because his family had been told that he was going to be harvested for organs. They were preparing for that. Yeah. This guy comes back.
Yeah, we know a lot about Roman crucifixion, and we know that they did their job well.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, if you look at, say, very skeptical biblical scholars, like non-believing, atheist, agnostic Christian scholars, they will say if we can know anything about Jesus, like they'll cast a doubt on a lot of the things that we read about in the Gospels in terms of the actual historical Jesus of Nazareth. They'll say one thing we can be sure of is that he died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Because we have not just multiple attested documents that we refer to as the New Testament, but Roman and Greek and Jewish writers refer to that claim frame afterwards and talk about the fact that you have this guy, and it's mocked within earliest Christianity. The earliest depiction of Jesus on the cross is called the Alexamenos Graphido, and it's probably from the end of the first century. It depicts an individual with their arms raised in an act of worship, worshiping a man with a donkey's head who's being crucified. Whoa. And right beside it, it says Alexamenos worships his God in Greek. Whoa. And it's mocking because crucifixion was for the lowest of the low. It was for like slaves. In fact, if you were a Roman citizen, you were banned from being crucified. When we do history, it's an inference to the best explanation. Mm-hmm. And so there are probabilities of things that have happened in history where we can say, okay, there's a higher probability of event A happening and a lower probability of event B happening. So the example I often give is like Jonah being swallowed by the fish. That's low probabilistically. Not that it didn't happen, but that like as a historian, we got to like say, well, there's no independent cross-reference sources. You don't have multiple attestation for this particular event. The interesting thing about Jesus is that we have more evidence from different writings in the ancient world than we probably should have for someone of his stature. Because we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, these 4 biographies. There's really only one other person in and around that time that can claim to have that much kind of independent testimony of their life, and it's the Roman Emperor Tiberius. So he also has 4 biographers. He has Cassio Dio, Suetonius, Tacitus, and Velius Paterculus. And so the Roman emperor, who's the most famous, most powerful person at the time, has a similar amount of historiographical evidence biographically for his, the events of his lifetime that Jesus does.
What is the interpretation of Jesus from non-Jesus followers at the time? Like what did they think he was or who he was?
He was a crucified traveling rabbi. So you have individuals like Josephus mentions him, end of 1st century, beginning of 2nd century. He was a Jewish Roman writer. Tacitus mentions him, who also wrote about the emperor. And, you have a number of these individuals, Cassio or Suetonius. But what they're doing mostly is describing what the followers of Christianity are saying about him. So you do have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt in that they're not saying things that they believe happened. They're talking about things that Christians believe happened.
And this is the part where they transition into talking about the authority of the 4 Gospels. Because, one of the things that if you talk to people, they'll say, well, how can we trust, the 4 Gospels? There are many Gospels that were circulating around. Have you heard about the Gospel of Thomas and all these other writings? How do we know that, Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John had it right? And I love how he goes into the historical basis of how we evaluate these different documents and what criteria we use. Why did these books make it into the canon and these other books didn't?
And how did they pick the order that these stories are in the Bible? And are there any books that were excluded, like where there's debate on it?
Yeah, great question. So this is the issue of what's sometimes called the canon of Scripture. So very early on, when you have Christians having these conversations, the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's unanimous agreement about those. And that's not to say that there aren't other Gospels that pop up. It's that you have this chain of custody that goes back to the earliest Jesus community. Jesus has disciples, and there's a group of individuals who we call the Apostolic Fathers, who are the disciples of Jesus's disciples. And so they comment on the books that the disciples of Jesus, or that people within the community of the disciples of Jesus wrote. And so we actually have a very close connection to the time. And we see early on that you have guys like Ignatius of Antioch arguing that there are only 4 Gospels. He's in the 2nd century, and there couldn't be any more than 4. Or Theophilus of Antioch makes the similar argument. Now, Ignatius of Antioch also talks about other Gospels, but he specifically highlights the fact that the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Truth, Gospel of the Hebrews, Gospel of, these ones that we kind of hear about, Mary, Judas, that the reason we know that they're not associated with the names that are attached to them is because they're being written in times when those people were dead, and they have these rings of pagan philosophy that are incorporated into them, which is completely foreign to 1st century Judaism. So Jesus would not have, so in the Gospel of James, Jesus is worshiping a goddess named Sophia. It's like, okay, well, no 1st century Jew is going to do that. That's obviously paganism. And by basically the end of the 2nd century, we have more or less a unanimous agreement of the 27 books being those that encapsulate Scripture that can be tied to either someone who knew Jesus or someone who knew Jesus.
And so these books that were not included, are any of them interesting? I mean,
they're all interesting.
But does any of it seem like it belongs in the New Testament?
Well, so part of the problem with some of these other books is they appear to be almost completely reliant on the other book. And some of them have an agenda to them. So like the Docetic Gospel of Peter seems to be uncomfortable with the fact that the biblical Gospels, Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have women being the first witnesses to the empty tomb. Because in the ancient world, women were not seen as good eyewitnesses. So you almost have this apologetic trying to solve that problem by having all the right people be witness to the resurrection. So you have all the Roman and Jewish officials camping out in front of the tomb, which also gives away the fact that like no Jewish priest on the eve of Passover is going to be camping out in front of a dead body. Like they didn't do that. So it betrays that the author of the Gospel of Peter has no understanding of purity ritual rites within first century Second Temple Judaism, but is also clearly trying to remedy this embarrassing fact.
Wow. That's what's so interesting about trying to interpret this stuff. You have to think about it in the terms of the culture of the times.
Yeah. And one of the most interesting ways that we figure out, okay, how can we tie, say, the Gospel of Matthew to the first century in Judea is studies that have been done on name frequency. In fact, Jamie, are you able to, if you go on Apologetics Canada, our YouTube page, so the first episode of the Can I Trust the Bible series we did, we made an animation about this, where we looked at the data and then we actually compared it to one of these other Gospels, to the Gospel of Judas. So in the first episode of Can I Trust the Bible, in the right books, partway through, it's near the end, the last animation, if you can find it, we had a guy put this together for us where we looked at the studies, and there have been some really recent ones by a guy named Luke Vanderway who published this in Birmingham University. He did his PhD on it, and he narrowed the gap within all of these literary bodies that talk about names, and we're able to pinpoint and actually show, if you go to, right here.
Particular decades that they're writing.
A series of scholarly studies has shown that though Jews were located in many places across the Roman Empire, people's names often tended to be geographically located. By observing literary and archaeological artifacts, a list of common names can be clearly identified. By narrowing down the most popular names in places that Jesus lived, traveled, and ministered, and by comparing these to the list from the studies, an interesting correlation can be seen. Just as we see today with popular names, a qualifier or nickname is often used. For example, notice that when Matthew lists the disciples in his gospel, certain names have a qualifier or nickname and others do not. Simon, called Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. As we would expect, the most popular names are those that have an added description. When we compare the most popular names in Judea and Galilee during the first century with names we see listed in key places in the biblical Gospels, we find that all the names with qualifiers match with what we'd assume if they were actually written in the time and place they claim to be narrating. In contrast, the Gospel of Judas only has two names that would fit, Jesus and Judas, but contains a host of other characters whose names match not with first century Judea or Galilee, like the biblical Gospels, but with names that were popular in Egypt during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Consider how difficult it would be for someone living outside of the locations and times that these events took place to get the right names with the right qualifiers. We have 4 biblical Gospels with 4 different authors, and yet each gets this test of naming frequency and attribution right every time. A test and standard that the non-biblical Gospels simply do not pass.
So that's so interesting. It totally makes sense too.
Yeah, so it's the levels of methodology that we can use to find internal accuracy. If we really want to figure out, okay, where was this written? And is it coming from early eyewitness testimony? We look at something like the biblical Gospels and they fit the bill for something that's written in first century Judea. But if we look at something like the other Gospels, they're doing things like the Gospel of Judas does, where other characters are coming up with names that are almost either non-existent or like very unpopular in places like Judea and Galilee, but are popular in 3rd and 4th century Egypt. So what can we then conclude from that? Well, this is being written in 3rd or 4th century Egypt.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. That's really amazing.
Wow, guys, what an incredible conversation, guys. I just love this. This goes to show that, we as Christians, we don't believe in some kind of myth or fairy tale or something that is not rooted, like I said, in reality and history. We truly believe in a Son of God. The fact that we are even still to this day having this conversation about Jesus Christ is evidence in itself of the fact that whoever this Jesus was, he was no ordinary human. And we as Christians, we believe that he truly was the Son of God, that he died for our sins on the cross under the Roman crucifixion. And we know that he resurrected, that he ascended to the Father, and that he's coming back. We believe in that. We also believe in the miracles in the Bible, because the fact that this world came into the place is a miracle in itself. So, and if we can believe in the Big Bang, why would we have a problem with the miracle of the resurrection? So overall, what a great conversation. And I hope you guys took so much points for yourself as Christians. And if you're not a believer, I hope that you are challenged to truly go into the Word of God, because it is an absolutely credible document, even just historically. Thank you so much, guys, for watching this conversation. I hope that you like and comment on this video. I hope you subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.